I have spent enough years on the bench to know exactly when someone believes they are untouchable. It is not always the way they dress. It is not always the way they speak. Sometimes it is the way they laugh. And I still remember the day a woman named Karen Walker sat in my courtroom, looked directly at me, laughed at my age, and convinced herself she had already won. What she did not know was that sitting only a few feet away was the one person capable of destroying everything she thought was protected, her own husband. And believe me, when the truth finally surfaced, even I struggled to stay composed. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now let me take you back to where this case truly began. The plaintiff was a man named Daniel Foster, 42 years old, former military mechanic, soft-spoken, disciplined. The kind of man who sat quietly with both hands folded on top of a neatly organized folder. Years on the bench teach you to observe people before they ever speak. Daniel looked nervous, not dishonest, not aggressive. Nervous, there is a difference. Across from him sat Karen Walker, 40 years old. Expensive jewelry on store, handbag, perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect smile. At least it looked perfect until you paid attention to her eyes. Her eyes never smiled. That detail stayed with me. People often forget that confidence and arrogance are not the same thing. Confidence comes from preparation. Arrogance comes from assumption. Karen had arrogance, a great deal of it. Beside her sat her husband, Christopher Walker, tall, well-dressed business executive. Very quiet. That bothered me immediately. Not because quiet people are suspicious, because married couples involved in litigation usually behave differently. They communicate, whisper, exchange notes. Share reactions. Christopher barely looked at Karen. Interesting. Very interesting. I noticed it within the first 5 minutes. The case appeared straightforward. Daniel claimed he sold a restored 1969 muscle car to Christopher Walker for $92,000. According to Daniel, Christopher inspected the vehicle, signed the agreement, accepted delivery, and transferred payment. 2 weeks later, the payment was reversed. Christopher claimed fraud. Karen claimed the vehicle had undisclosed defects. Daniel claimed everything had been disclosed before the sale, a fairly ordinary contract dispute, at least initially. Then Karen started talking, and the atmosphere changed immediately. I asked Daniel to explain the transaction. He stood carefully, presented documents, inspection reports, photographs, maintenance records, everything organized, everything documented. Karen interrupted before he finished his second sentence. He conveniently left out the important part. I looked at her. You will have an opportunity to speak. He always does this. You will have an opportunity to speak. She leaned back dramatically. The spectators exchanged looks. I noticed years on the bench teach you that people often reveal themselves during interruptions. Some interrupt because they are emotional. Others interrupt because they fear where the testimony is going. Karen appeared to be the second type. Daniel continued. He explained how Christopher contacted him through a collector vehicle marketplace, how they exchanged emails, how Christopher hired an independent inspector, how the inspection passed, how the sale proceeded. Everything seemed straightforward. Then I noticed something. Every time Daniel mentioned Christopher, Karen answered, not Christopher, Karen. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked toward Christopher. Did you hire the inspector? Before he could answer, yes, Karen said. I turned toward her. Was that question directed at you? The room became quiet. Karen smiled. A smile that seemed designed to communicate that rules were optional. No, then allow your husband to answer. Christopher cleared his throat. Yes. The answer was simple, direct. And unlike Karen's responses, it contained no performance response. That observation stayed with me. I continued reviewing documents. The inspection report appeared thorough, extremely thorough. Compression tests, fault measurements, engine analysis, electrical review. Nothing suggested fraud. Nothing suggested deception. Yet Christopher reversed $92,000. Interesting. Very interesting. I asked why. Before Christopher could answer, Karen interrupted again. Because the car was garbage. The spectators shifted. Daniel looked confused, not offended, confused. I understood why, because the report in front of me suggested exactly the opposite. Miss Walker, I said, what specifically was wrong with the vehicle? Karen crossed her arms, the whole thing. Interesting answer. Vague answers often signal weak evidence. What specifically? What about it? It had problems. What problems? Silence. Then another silence. Then Karen glanced toward Christopher. That glance caught my attention because moments earlier she answered everything herself. Now she suddenly needed his help. Interesting, very interesting. Christopher remained silent. That surprised her. I could see it, just a flicker, a tiny expression, gone almost instantly, but I noticed. Years of courtroom experience teach you to watch for disappointment. Karen expected support. She did not receive it. That mattered. Then I found an email, a very interesting email. Sent 3 days after Christopher received the vehicle. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, because the language directly contradicted everything Karen was saying. I looked up, Mr. Walker. Christopher looked toward me. Did you send this? He nodded. Yes. The room became quiet. I began reading. Daniel, the car exceeded expectations. It's one of the cleanest restorations I've ever purchased. The spectators exchanged looks. Daniel lowered his head slightly. Karen stopped smiling. Interesting, very interesting. Because now we had a problem, a significant problem. Christopher praised the vehicle, then disputed the payment. Those two things rarely coexist comfortably. I looked toward Karen. Her expression hardened. Then suddenly she laughed, not loudly. Just enough the courtroom became silent. Something amusing? I asked. She looked directly at me and then said the sentence that changed everything. Well, I guess when you've been doing this as long as you have, you probably forget how modern business works. Several spectators froze. Christopher closed his eyes. Interesting, very interesting, because unlike Karen, Christopher immediately understood she had made a mistake, a very serious mistake. Years on the bench teach you that insults rarely help a case, especially when they reveal more about the speaker than the target. Karen smiled again, clearly pleased with herself. But I wasn't paying attention to her anymore. I was looking at Christopher because the moment she laughed about my age, I noticed something disturbing in his reaction. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, fear, real fear. And for the first time that morning, I began wondering whether Christopher Walker was hiding something much bigger than a disputed car sale. The moment I noticed fear on Christopher Walker's face, my attention shifted, not away from Karen, but beyond her. Years on the bench teach you that the loudest person in the room is not always the most important one. Sometimes the real story sits quietly beside them. And Christopher was becoming increasingly interesting. Karen, meanwhile, seemed delighted with herself. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and wore the kind of smile people wear when they believe they have just established dominance. What she failed to understand was that courtrooms do not operate on dominance. They operate on facts. And facts were beginning to move in a direction she did not expect. I returned my attention to Christopher. You stated in writing that the vehicle exceeded expectations. Yes. You described it as one of the cleanest restorations you had ever purchased. Yes. Then why dispute the payment? Before he could answer, Karen interrupted Egan. Because we later discovered problems. Interesting, very interesting, because Christopher hadn't said that Karen had. I looked directly at her. Ems Walker, I am asking your husband. She rolled her eyes, actually rolled her eyes. Several spectators noticed. So did I. Years on the bench teach you that contempt often appears when a person begins losing control. Karen was losing control. She simply didn't know it yet. Christopher cleared his throat. The vehicle wasn't the reason. The courtroom froze. Karen turned toward him immediately. The reaction was instant, like someone hearing a sentence they desperately hoped would never be spoken. Interesting. Very interesting. I leaned slightly forward. The vehicle wasn't the reason. Christopher hesitated. Yes, the room became quiet. Not ordinary quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives when everyone realizes the story has changed. Daniel Foster looked confused. The spectators leaned forward. Karen stared at her husband, and I remember thinking one thing. Here we go, because after decades on the bench, you learn to recognize the moment a lie begins collapsing from the inside. Christopher looked exhausted, not nervous, not angry, exhausted, as though carrying something far heavier than a contract dispute. I asked a simple question. Then what was the reason? Before he could answer, Karen slammed her hand on the table, not violently, but hard enough. Christopher, the room froze. She didn't say anything else, just his name, but the message was obvious. Stop talking. Years on the bench teach you that sometimes the most revealing statements contain only one word. This was one of them. I looked toward Karen, then back toward Christopher. Mr. Walker, answer the question. Christopher swallowed. His eyes remained fixed on the table. Then he said something I will never forget. The payment reversal wasn't my idea. Silence, Dovlet silence. Karen's face changed instantly. The confidence disappeared, not completely, but enough for me to notice, enough for everyone to notice. Interesting, very interesting. I turned toward him. Whose idea was it? Karen immediately spoke. That's ridiculous. I raised one finger. She stopped, not because she wanted to, because she realized everyone was watching. The spectators weren't looking at Daniel anymore. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at Christopher. And Karen hated that. Christopher remained silent for several seconds, then finally answered, "My wife's." The room exploded with whispers. The court officer immediately called for order. Karen stared at him as if she could not believe what she had just heard. Honestly, neither could she, because people who spend years controlling others often forget one important thing. Eventually, those people get tired, and Christopher looked very tired. I asked another question. Did you want to reverse the payment? No. The answer came immediately. Interesting, very interesting, because truthful answers often arrive quickly once someone decides to stop protecting a lie. I watched Karen carefully. Her breathing changed. Her posture changed. Everything changed. The woman who spent the morning controlling the conversation was suddenly losing control of the most important witness in the room, her own husband. Then I found another email, a very interesting email, one that had been overlooked earlier. I reviewed it once, then twice, then a third time, because the sender wasn't Daniel, the sender wasn't Karen, the sender was Christopher, and the recipient was his accountant. Interesting, very interesting. The timing caught my attention immediately. The message was sent only 2 days before the payment reversal. I looked toward Christopher. Did you send this? He nodded. Yes. Karen closed her eyes. That reaction alone told me the email mattered. I began reading. Karen wants me to reverse the transaction. I told her the vehicle is exactly as described. The courtroom became silent. I continued. I'm uncomfortable with this. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Karen remained silent because there it was. Not speculation, not interpretation. Decogmentation, Christopher had already admitted the car was legitimate. Privately, before the dispute ever happened, interesting, very interesting. I looked toward Daniel Foster. The man looked stunned. Not because he was winning, because he was finally understanding what happened. That observation mattered. People often imagine courtroom victories feel exciting. Many times they feel confusing, especially when the truth turns out stranger than expected. Then I noticed something else in the email thread, a reply from the accountant reply. Only one sentence, but the sentence immediately caught my attention. I read it silently, then again, then a third time. Because I wanted to be absolutely certain, I looked toward Christopher, then Karen, then back at the screen, because suddenly this case wasn't just about a payment dispute anymore. It was about something much larger. The accountant's response read, if Karen uses the same strategy she used with the Florida property, this could become a serious problem. The room froze. I slowly looked up. Karen had gone completely pale, and for the first time that morning, she looked genuinely terrified. The moment I read the accountant's message aloud, the entire courtroom changed. Not gradually, instantly, because one phrase suddenly became more important than everything else we had discussed. The Florida property, interesting, very interesting. Until that moment, we were discussing a restored muscle car, a disputed payment, a contract disagreement. Now there was something else, something from the past. Something serious enough that an accountant felt compelled to reference it in writing, and judging by Karen Walker's reaction, she knew exactly what it meant. The room was silent. Daniel Foster looked confused. The spectators exchanged glances. Christopher stared at the table. Karen stared at me. Years on the bench teach you that people often reveal the importance of a subject before anyone even knows what the subject is. Karen's expression told me everything. The Florida property mattered a lot. I turned toward Christopher. What did your accountant mean? Christopher hesitated. Not because he didn't know, because he did. That distinction matters. There is a difference between uncertainty and reluctance. Christopher looked reluctant, very reluctant. Before he could answer, Karen interrupted. Egan, it has nothing to do with this case. Interesting answer. Not. That's incorrect. Not. There is no Florida property. Not. My accountant was mistaken. Instead, it has nothing to do with this case. Years of courtroom experience have made me highly suspicious of answers that avoid the truth without actually denying it. I looked directly at her. Then explaining it should be easy. Silence. Karen crossed her arms. Again, that familiar defensive posture returned, and every time it appeared, I became more convinced she felt trapped. Christopher finally spoke quietly. The property dispute happened 3 years ago. The spectators leaned forward. Interesting, very interesting, because now we had confirmation. There was a dispute, a real dispute. Karen closed her eyes. I noticed that reaction suggested Christopher had crossed a line she desperately wanted protected. I asked him to continue. The contractor completed the renovation. The room became quiet. Karen disputed the payments. Interesting, very interesting, the same pattern. Immediately I noticed it. Years on the bench teach you to pay attention when separate events begin sharing identical structures. Contractor collapsed work, paint bent dispute found familiar. It should, because it sounded exactly like Daniel Foster's situation. Christopher continued. The contractor sued. Karen looked furious, actually furious, not embarrassed, not nervous, furious. That fascinated me because anger often appears when a person loses control over information. And Karen was losing control rapidly. I asked a simple question. What happened in the lawsuit? Christopher looked toward Karen, then toward me, then back toward the table. The contractor won. Silence, Dabasel silence. The spectators immediately reacted, not loudly, but visibly, because now the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One disputed payment could be a misunderstanding. Two disputed payments begin looking like something else. Interesting. Very interesting. I turned toward Karen. Did you lose that case? A pause. Then, yes. The answer sounded painful, as though saying it physically hurt. I understood why. Because every answer Christopher provided was weakening her position, and every answer she provided afterward confirmed it. Then I reviewed the accountant's email again. Something bothered me. A specific phrase. If Karen uses the same strategy, interesting word, very interesting word. People do not usually describe isolated mistakes as strategies. Strategies imply repetition. Planning got dented. I looked toward Christopher. What strategy was the accountant referring to? The room became silent. Karen immediately spoke. Christopher, stop. There it was directly. Not subtle, not implied. Stop. Years on the bench teach you that innocent people rarely try to stop truthful testimony. That observation stayed with me. I looked toward Christopher. Answer the question. He swallowed, then finally said, chargebacks. Interesting, very interesting, because suddenly everything connected. The contractor, the vehicle, the payment disputes, the accountant, everything. Christopher continued. She would approve projects. The room remained silent. Then dispute payments later. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Karen seemed unable to interrupt because Christopher was no longer hesitating. The truth had momentum now, and momentum is difficult to stop. I asked another question. How often? Christopher closed his eyes briefly, then answered. More than once. Interesting, not a number, but enough. Years on the bench teach you that people often reveal truth gradually when they feel guilty. Christopher seemed to be reaching that point. Then something happened I did not expect. Daniel Foster raised his hand, very respectfully. I allowed him to speak. He looked directly at Christopher, not Karen. Christopher. Then asked one simple question. Did you ever think about what that does to people? The courtroom became silent. The question wasn't legal. It wasn't strategic. It was human. And that is why it mattered. Christopher looked at Daniel for several seconds, then lowered his head. Yes, the answer sounded genuine, painfully genuine. I watched Karen carefully. For the first time all day, she looked alone. That observation stayed with me because people who control others often appear powerful until the people they control stop cooperating. Then the illusion disappears very quickly. I thought the case had already become extraordinary. I was wrong because moments later I discovered something hidden inside the accounting records. Something nobody had mentioned, something neither Karen nor Christopher expected me to find. I reviewed the transaction history once, then twice, then a third time, because the numbers did not make sense. Several disputed payments appeared, several recovered funds appeared, and then I found a transfer, a very interesting transfer. One made only 3 days after Daniel's payment was reversed. I slowly looked up. Karen saw my expression and instantly went pale because the money didn't disappear. It went somewhere. And according to the records, that somewhere was an account Karen had never disclosed to anyone in the courtroom. The moment I discovered the transfer, I stopped listening to what was being said in the courtroom, not permanently, just long enough to focus on the numbers, because numbers have a habit of telling stories people never intend to tell. And the story these numbers were telling was deeply troubling. The courtroom remained silent. Karen Walker was staring directly at me. Christopher Walker was staring at the table. Daniel Foster looked confused. The spectators could sense something had changed. They simply didn't know what yet. I reviewed the transfer again, then a third time, because I wanted to eliminate every possibility before drawing conclusions. Years on the bench teach you to be careful. Assumptions are dangerous. Documentation is not. And the documentation was clear. 3 days after Daniel's $92,000 payment was reversed, a substantial amount of money appeared in a separate financial account, an account that had never been mentioned, never disclosed, never discussed. Interesting, very interesting. I looked toward Karen Walker. No answer. Would you like to explain this account? The reaction was immediate, too immediate. Her eyes widened, her breathing changed, and for the first time all day, she didn't interrupt. That observation mattered, because people like Karen survive through control. When they stop talking, it often means something important has happened. I held up the records. This account belongs to you, correct? Silence. Then, yes. Interesting. Very interesting, because now we had confirmation. Not speculation, not theory. Confirmation. I asked another question. Why wasn't this account disclosed? Karen shifted in her chair. Because it wasn't relevant. The spectators exchanged looks. So did I. Not relevant. Interesting answer, because money connected to the exact timing of a disputed transaction tends to become very relevant very quickly. I turned toward Christopher. Were you aware of this account? The answer came immediately. No. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Karen looked shocked, actually shocked. That reaction caught my attention. She expected a different answer, a very different answer. Years on the bench teach you that surprise often reveals hidden assumptions. Karen assumed Christopher would protect her. Again, instead, he was telling the truth. Again, that pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. I reviewed additional records. Then something disturbing emerged. The account wasn't new. It had existed for years. Several years. Interesting, very interesting. And as I traced transaction histories, another pattern appeared, a familiar pattern: transfers following disputes, transfers following chargebacks, transfers following recovered payments. And again, the room became quiet, not because anyone understood everything yet, because everyone sensed where the evidence was leading. I remember looking toward Karen and thinking something very simple. She wasn't reacting like someone caught in a misunderstanding. She was reacting like someone watching a secret unravel. Then I found another transfer, and another, and another. The amounts varied. The timing did not. That timing bothered me a lot, because timing often reveals intent. And these transactions appeared remarkably consistent. Then I noticed something even more interesting. The account wasn't solely connected to Karen. Another authorized user appeared. I read the name once. Then again, then a third time, because I wanted to be certain. I looked up slowly. Karen immediately knew. The color disappeared from her face. Christopher looked confused. Daniel looked confused. The spectators looked confused. Only Karen understood. That observation fascinated me, because it meant she already knew what I had found. Years on the bench teach you that guilt often arrives before exposure. I looked toward her. Who is Jonathan Mercer? The room froze. Karen closed her eyes. Interesting, very interesting. Because she didn't ask who. She didn't deny knowing him. She simply closed her eyes. Christopher immediately looked toward her. That reaction alone told me something important. He had never heard the name before. I watched him carefully. His confusion appeared genuine, painfully genuine. Then I turned back to Karen. "Who is Jonathan Mercer?" A long silence followed, the longest silence of the day. Then she finally answered, "My brother." Interesting, very interesting, because the account records listed him as an authorized user, not merely a relative. An authorized user. That distinction mattered. I reviewed more documents, and suddenly another connection appeared. Jonathan Mercer's name appeared elsewhere, not once, multiple times. In property records, in financial transfers, in prior disputes. Interesting, very interesting. The deeper I looked, the more often the same names appeared. Karen, Jonathan, disputed payments, recovered funds. The pattern was growing. Then I found the document that changed everything. A memorandum tenor private, never intended for courtroom review. The moment I saw it, I understood why Karen looked terrified. I read it silently, then again, then a third time because the language was extraordinary. I looked toward Karen. "Did you write this?" No answer. "Ms. Walker?" Another silence. Then, yes. The room became completely silent. I began reading. "Christopher can never know where the money is actually going." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Christopher stopped breathing for a moment. I continued. "If he finds out about Jonathan's account, everything falls apart." The spectators gasped. Daniel stared at Karen. Christopher looked like he had been physically struck. And honestly, even after everything else, I still wasn't prepared for that sentence, because suddenly this case wasn't just about disputed payments. It wasn't just about hidden money. It wasn't just about chargebacks. It was about deception inside a marriage. Years of courtroom experience have taught me something. Business lies are damaging. Personal lies are devastating. And judging by Christopher's face, he was realizing that in real time. Then I found one final attachment, a spreadsheet, a very detailed spreadsheet. I reviewed the first page, then the second, then the third. And the more I read, the more concerned I became. Because according to the spreadsheet, the hidden account wasn't holding thousands of dollars. It wasn't holding tens of thousands. It was holding enough money to destroy everything Karen had been telling her husband for years. And she knew it. I have watched people lose lawsuits. I have watched people lose businesses. I have watched people lose fortunes. But few moments compare to watching someone realize they are about to lose a secret they spent years protecting. That was Karen Walker. The moment I opened the spreadsheet, she stopped looking at me. She stopped looking at Christopher. She stopped looking at anyone. Instead, she stared at the table. And believe me, years on the bench teach you that people rarely avoid eye contact unless they already know what is coming. The courtroom was silent. Christopher sat motionless. Daniel Foster looked completely lost. The spectators could feel the tension, but they still didn't know why. Only Karen did. And now, so did I. I reviewed the spreadsheet carefully. The records stretched back several years. Transfers, deposits, withdrawals, high allocations, everything meticulously tracked. Interesting, very interesting, because people who operate dishonest systems often keep surprisingly good records. They don't trust other people, so they document everything. Karen had documented everything, because the problem was that documentation had finally reached a courtroom. I continued reading. Then I found the total, and I remember pausing, not because I misunderstood it, because I wanted to make sure I hadn't. I checked again, then a third time. The number remained the same. The hidden account contained more than $740,000. The room froze. Dazzled silence. Christopher stared at me, then at Karen, then back at me. He looked confused, truly confused. And that observation disturbed me, because if Christopher was acting, he deserved an award, but he wasn't acting. Years on the bench teach you how genuine shock looks. This was genuine, painfully genuine. I looked toward Karen. Did your husband know about these funds? The answer came immediately. No. Interesting. Very interesting, because for the first time all day, Karen answered honestly without hesitation. That told me something. The evidence had become too overwhelming. There was nowhere left to hide. I turned toward Christopher. His face had gone pale. Mr. Walker. He slowly shook his head. No. The answer barely escaped his mouth. The spectators exchanged stunned looks. Daniel Foster looked like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Honestly, neither could most people in the room, because suddenly the case had transformed. What started as a vehicle dispute was now exposing years of hidden financial activity, and we still weren't finished. I continued reviewing the spreadsheet. Then I noticed something, a category label. Interesting, very interesting, because categories reveal intent. People name things for reasons. This category was labeled recovered funds. The room became silent again. I opened the transaction history beneath it and immediately understood why Karen looked terrified. The deposits matched disputed payments, not all of them, but many of them. The Florida contractor, several renovation projects, multiple business disputes, and then Daniel Foster. His $92,000 payment appeared on the list. The spectators gasped. Christopher closed his eyes. Karen looked away, because there it was. The money hadn't vanished. It hadn't been lost. It hadn't been held pending investigation. It had been collected, tracked, stored, and documented. Years on the bench teach you that truth often appears gradually, then suddenly. This was one of those moments. Everything clicked: the disputes, the chargebacks, the hidden account, the accountant's warning, the Florida lawsuit, everything. Then Christopher spoke, quickly, almost to himself. How long? The courtroom remained silent. Karen didn't answer. Christopher looked at her. How long? Still nothing. Then, for the first time all day, his voice cracked. How long have you been doing this? That question changed the emotional atmosphere of the room, because it wasn't legal anymore. It was personal. And personal truths are often the hardest ones. Karen finally answered.
Years.
Silence, Dobitzel, silence. I watched Christopher carefully. The realization was arriving slowly, painfully, publicly. Not only had Karen hidden the money, she had hidden the behavior, the disputes, the accounts, the transfers, everything. Years of deception. Then I found the document that created the viral courtroom moment people would discuss for years afterward. A private message sent from Karen to Jonathan Mercer. Only a few lines, but enough. More than enough. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, because even after everything else, I could hardly believe it. I looked toward Karen. She already knew. The color had disappeared from her face completely. I looked toward Christopher, then toward the courtroom, then I read it aloud. Christopher still believes the business investments failed. The room froze. I continued. If he ever learns where the money really came from, he'll leave. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The spectators sat stunned. Daniel stared at Karen. Christopher looked like the floor beneath him had disappeared, and then came the final sentence, the sentence that shattered everything. He's easier to manage when he thinks we're struggling. The courtroom erupted, actual gasps, whispers, shock. The court officer called repeatedly for silence. Karen closed her eyes, because there it was, not merely financial deception, manipulation, deliberate manipulation of her own husband. Years on the bench teach you something important. People can forgive losses. They can forgive mistakes. They can even forgive poor decisions. What destroys trust is manipulation. And judging by Christopher's expression, trust had just died. Then something unexpected happened. Christopher stood up slowly, quickly. The room became silent again. He looked directly at Karen for several seconds, then said 4 words, 4 simple words I will never forget. "Who are you?" The room froze. Karen started crying. Not strategically, not performatively, actually crying. Because for the first time all day, the person she feared losing most finally understood the truth. And what happened next? Even Karen never saw coming. I have presided over cases involving fraud, betrayal, theft, deception, and broken promises. But some moments stay with you because they reveal something deeper. Not what people did, who they became. And when Christopher Walker looked at his wife and asked, "Who are you?" I knew I was witnessing one of those moments. The courtroom was silent. Not because people were waiting for a legal ruling, because they were watching a marriage collapse under the weight of the truth. Karen sat motionless, tears running down her face. The confidence she brought into the courtroom that morning was gone. The arrogance was gone. The laughter was gone. All that remained was reality, and reality had arrived with documents. Years on the bench teach you that reality usually arrives that way, not through dramatic speeches, not through emotional arguments, through records, dat and pons, bank statements, transfers, facts. Christopher remained standing. He wasn't angry. That was what struck me. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even arguing. He looked hurt, deeply hurt. And sometimes hurt is more powerful than anger, because anger can fade. Betrayal lingers. I watched Karen carefully. For the first time all day, she stopped trying to defend herself. That mattered. People spend enormous amounts of energy protecting lies. Eventually, they become too exhausted to continue. Karen had reached that point. The courtroom remained silent. Then Christopher asked another question, quietly. "Was any of it true?" Interesting, very interesting, because he wasn't asking about the money anymore. He was asking about everything. The business struggles, the failed investments, the financial problems, the explanations, the stories, all of it. Years of courtroom experience have taught me that people often discover betrayal in layers. The money hurts, the lies hurt more. Karen lowered her head, then answered. Some of it. The room remained silent. Christopher nodded slowly, not because he accepted the answer, because he finally understood it. That distinction matters. Acceptance and understanding are not the same thing. He understood who she was. Whether he accepted it was another matter entirely. I returned my attention to the dispute before the court, Daniel Foster's claim, the restored muscle car. The reversed payment, the evidence was overwhelming, the vehicle was properly disclosed, the inspections occurred, the purchase was voluntary, the payment reversal was improper. That part of the case had become remarkably simple. The complicated part was everything surrounding it. I reviewed the final records, the contracts, the emails, the bank statements. The accountant's correspondence, the hidden account, the spreadsheet, every document pointed in the same direction, not confusion, not misunderstanding, intentional conduct, repeated conduct, documented conduct, and most importantly, a pattern. Pawpaws matter. One dispute may be an accident. Repeated disputes become a strategy. Karen's own records prove that I turned toward Daniel. The man looked exhausted. Months of uncertainty, months of frustration, months of wondering whether anyone would believe him. Now he finally had answers. I imagine that felt strange, because answers do not always provide comfort. Sometimes they simply explain pain, and pain explained is still pain. I issued my ruling. Judgment entered in favor of Daniel Foster. The evidence supported his position completely. The payment reversal was improper. The funds were owed. The contract remained valid. Sybil clear. Supported by facts, Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Relief, not celebration, relief. I have seen that expression many times. People expect courtroom victories to feel triumphant. Often they feel exhausting, because by the time justice arrives, people are already tired. Then I looked toward Karen, the woman who laughed at my age, the woman who entered the courtroom convinced she controlled the situation, the woman who believed she could direct the conversation, control her husband, and manipulate the facts. Now she sat silently. And honestly, the irony was difficult to ignore, because the very thing she mocked had exposed her. Experience, years on the bench, teach you to recognize patterns. Years teach you to recognize rehearsed stories. Years teach you to notice when one witness talks too much and another talks too little. Years teach you when someone is hiding something. Karen laughed at age. What she failed to understand was that experience often comes with age. And experience saw right through her. As people began leaving the courtroom, Christopher remained standing, not beside Karen, not behind her, separate. That image stayed with me because physical distance often reflects emotional distance, and there was a great deal of distance between them now. I later learned that additional financial reviews followed. Questions were asked. Records were examined. Several matters extended beyond the original dispute, as they should have. But what I remember most isn't the investigations, it isn't the money, it isn't even the hidden account. It's the moment Karen laughed because she believed she was mocking weakness. In reality, she was underestimating experience. That mistake changed everything. Years have passed since that case. I have heard countless others. Many involved larger amounts of money. Many attracted more attention. Yet this one remains unforgettable, not because of the ruling, because of the lesson. People often believe intelligence means staying one step ahead of everyone else. Real wisdom is understanding that the truth eventually catches up. Karen spent years constructing a story for her husband, a story for businesses, a story for banks, a story for anyone willing to listen. Then one day she walked into a courtroom, and the facts told a different story, a much more accurate one. Karen Walker laughed at my age. Scons later, her husband was exposed to a truth he never expected to discover. And by the time the hearing ended, the person most exposed wasn't Christopher. It was Karen herself, because in the end, the most dangerous thing about deception isn't getting caught. It's believing you never will. And that belief destroyed everything she thought was safe.